I showed you how to cut out the Lowland Kids Dolman tee using the Ozkraft custom printing Dolman yards. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to sew it. If you missed that video, just go back to my page. It looks like this. After you have all your pattern pieces cut out, you should have 2 front and back bodices, a neckband, 2 arm cuffs, and then finally your waistband. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my back bodice, lay that out with my right side facing up, and then I'm going to take my front bodice with right sides facing down, and I'm just going to line up both of these pieces. I'm going to line them up at the shoulders and at the side seams, since that is where we will be sewing or serging first. And after you have these all lined up, what you can do is you can place pins or clips, whatever you prefer to use, so that it keeps your fabric together. After we do that, now we're going to prepare all of our bands. So this is my neckband. I'm going to lay this out long ways, fold it in half with my right sides touching. And then after I have that lined up, I'm going to fold it in half again in this direction. And then you can either put a little pin or a clip on the end of this if that's easier for you. Next is going to be my arm cuffs. So I'm going to take those, fold those together, right sides facing, and then I'm going to fold it in half one more time. And again, if you need to put a pin or a clip here to hold these together, you can do that as well. And we're going to go ahead and repeat that for our other arm cuff. Now we're going to do our waistband. So we're going to lay that down, fold it in half, right sides together, lining up at the ends, and then we're going to fold that in half as well. Now we're going to take this over to sew. So here I have all of my bands laid out, and we're going to sew along the short end of all of these. So I usually sew all of my bands at one time so that it's easier. I just go ahead and do my neckband, and then I'll do my arm cuffs and my waistband all on this one chain of thread. And then at the very end, I'll just go through and clip them off. So now I'm gonna take my neckband and I'm gonna flip it right side out. And where you sewed your seam at, you're gonna fold that neckband in half. And now where my left hand is gonna be the middle front of that neckband, and I'm going to put a pin there, and then I'm going to open it up and line up that pin with that same back seam, and then put 2 more pins on the opposite sides where my fingers are holding it. This is called quartering your band, and this is what you'll typically need to do when you're adding neckbands or any other kind of band, so that when you sew it on, it's even. Now you're going to repeat that process with all of your other bands, your waistband and your other 2 arm cuffs. When you get to your arm cuffs, you really only need 2 pins instead of 4, since you'll be matching your pins up with your shoulder seam and the armpit seam. So you don't need 4 pins here, you're okay with just 2. After you get all of your bands done, we're going to lay our front and back bodice pieces right sides together, and then we're going to sew at the shoulder seam first. So just across the top here, you can either serge or sew this. After you do your first shoulder seam, go ahead and repeat on your second shoulder seam. If you have those done, now we're going to line up our sleeves and down the sides of our bodice, because this is where we're going to sew or serge next. After you've done that, go ahead and flip your bodice right sides out. Once you have your bodice turned right sides out, you're going to pick up your bodice and line up the shoulder seams. With those shoulder seams lined up, your bodice should now be kind of folded in half. And this is where you will find the middle of the front and the middle of the back of your bodice, and that is where you want to put your pins, since that is where we will be lining up our neckband. Once you have that all pinned, go ahead and lay your bodice out flat, and now we're going to grab our neckband. Now, I typically like to put the seam on my neckband in the back of my bodice. So I will take my front middle of my neckband, pin that to the front middle of my bodice, and then take that back seam on your neckband and pin that to the back of your bodice. And now your other two side pins, you're gonna open up your bodice and just kind of stretch that out so that your neckband is laying flat on your bodice, and make sure that those pins are lining up with the side seams of your shoulder, because on some patterns it does not, and some patterns it does. After I get my neckband pinned on, I like to just open it up and stretch my neckband out a little, just to make sure that before I sew this on, it's actually gonna go on even. Once you're happy with your neckband, now we're gonna take this over to our machine and we're gonna sew this on in the round. So I typically like to start in the back, and you're just gonna kind of stretch out your neckband as you're serging or sewing this on. You don't want to stretch the bodice, only your neckband, and you want to stretch it to where it meets your next pin and everything's laying nice and flat. As you're coming up to where you started, I serge over that just a little bit, and that's where I will cut my seam. I will cut that down, and then I take a lighter and I just melt the top part of any seams that were left. Now that we've finished our neckband, I'm going to move to my cuffs. So here's my seam of my cuff, and I like to put that in the armpit area, so the seam on the bottom, so that when the child's wearing the shirt, the seam isn't sitting on top of their shoulder. So I'm just going to line up that seam with the seam of my shirt and put a pin there. And then on my other side, I'm going to match that pin up with the shoulder seam on my bodice. And after you have everything all pinned, just kind of double check your fabric and make sure that all 3 layers of fabric are lined up nice and even. This is a part that can be tricky for beginners, is sometimes those fabrics aren't lined up all the way, and then you have skipped over fabric or holes. So if it's easier for you, you can also wrap these bands and cuffs around this part of your serger. It just makes it a little bit easier when you're sewing and when you're stretching out your bands. Keep in mind that anytime you're sewing a band, you only want to stretch your band to the next pin. And once you come up to your seams, just kind of double check that those are lined up nicely before you sew them. Seams can be kind of tricky when you start out, but if you just lift it up and double check, you should get the hang of it. After you have your first arm cuff sewed on, go ahead and repeat this with the second one. Also remember that you put the seam of your cuff on the armpit sleeve of your bodice. You want those to match on both sides. After you finish your neckband and your arm cuffs, it's time to add on your waistband. So you're going to lay your bodice right side up, match up those side seams like we did with the neckband, and then you're going to put your pins in the front middle and the front back of your bodice now. After you have your bodice all pinned, now you can add on your waistband. You've already got your waistband pinned, so this should be pretty easy. Now with your waistband seam, it's going to be a preference thing. Sometimes you can line it up with the side of your bodice, or you can just put it in the back. It's totally up to you, whatever look you like better. I'm going to line mine up with the side of my bodice. So I pin that first, and then I go around and match up my pins on my bodice with my pins on my waistband. Once you have everything pinned, now it's time to sew it on. Probably going to be a lot easier for most people if you just wrap it around this part of your serger, and then you can lay your fabric under your presser foot. Go ahead and sew your waistband on, remembering to only stretch out your band and not the bodice as you're sewing. This is your last and final step, so when you're all finished, this is what it should look like. Here is what our front looks like, and here is our back.